She was abandoned, pregnant, and broke, but when she unveiled a secret, he begged for forgiveness. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the modest kitchen, cradling the pregnancy test in both hands. The tiny pink lines stared back at her, fragile and life-altering. For a moment, joy bloomed. This was the moment she and Oliver had talked about for years. She imagined telling him over dinner, maybe with a little gift box, or a surprise ultrasound in a frame. But the glow in her heart was quickly extinguished when he walked in, his face clouded with something she couldn't quite read. Before she could say a word, he dropped his keys on the counter and muttered, "We need to talk." The coldness in his voice chilled her to the bone. She opened her mouth to speak, but he went first. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he began, not meeting her eyes. "I don't want to be married anymore." Her breath caught. She felt dizzy. "Oliver." "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her voice trembling. But he just stared at her, not with the joy or shock she expected, but with indifference. "That's your problem now," he said, turning his back as if she were just some stranger on the street. "I didn't sign up for this." In a matter of seconds, Evelyn's world collapsed. The man she trusted, loved, built her life with, was walking away without a glance, leaving her alone with nothing but 2 pink lines and a sinking heart. The days that followed felt like a silent film playing on loop. Evelyn sat on the edge of their shared bed, still half expecting him to walk through the door with flowers and an apology, telling her it had all been a mistake. But Oliver never came back. His belongings slowly disappeared from the apartment, first his clothes, then his tools, finally the framed photos from their trips. The silence was deafening, filled only by the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional churn of her own stomach from morning sickness. She tried to call him, text him, email, but every message was left unanswered. The man who once promised to protect her in sickness and in health had vanished into the fog of cowardice. Worse still was the humiliation. Friends began to notice his absence. Her colleagues whispered in break rooms and avoided her eyes in meetings. When she visited his parents, desperately hoping for support, his mother simply looked her up and down and said, "We warned him about you. You always seemed needy." Evelyn stood there, clutching her purse and fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "I'm carrying your grandchild," she said quietly, but the door was already closing in her face. Each rejection cut deeper than the last. And as her bank account began to dwindle, the realization hit her like a punch: she was not only pregnant and alone, but broke. Truly, utterly alone in a world that had turned its back on her. Bills piled up on the kitchen table like a growing mountain she had no strength to climb. Evelyn tried to keep working, but the nausea, fatigue, and emotional weight wore her down. Her manager at the boutique, though initially sympathetic, began cutting her shifts. "We need people who can be reliable," she said with a tight smile. Evelyn bit her tongue and nodded, trying not to show the devastation behind her eyes. Groceries became a luxury. She skipped meals. She stretched a single box of pasta across 3 dinners, always saving the last bite for the life growing inside her. Yet nothing felt enough. Her body ached, her heart throbbed, and her spirit was thinning, thread by thread. The final blow came in a white envelope taped to her apartment door, an eviction notice. She hadn't been able to make rent in 2 months. She stared at it for a long time, numb. That night, Evelyn packed a single suitcase and left the apartment she had once called home. She walked the city streets under the flicker of tired street lamps, looking for anywhere she could rest. The shelters were full. The friends she reached out to responded with polite regrets or silence. Eventually, she found a park bench under an old oak tree. She wrapped her coat tightly around her belly, laid her head down, and cried until she was too tired to cry anymore. No one came looking for her. The world had moved on. The morning sun rose harsh and indifferent. Evelyn's joints ached from the cold metal bench. Her stomach growled, and the baby kicked softly inside her, like a reminder that she was still responsible for someone beyond herself. She sat up slowly, pressing a hand to her belly, and whispered, "I'm sorry." Her voice cracked in the crisp air. Just as she stood to move, a woman approached, bundled in a thick cardigan and carrying a basket of bread. She looked to be in her 70s, with soft white hair pulled into a low bun. She observed Evelyn with quiet understanding, not pity. "You don't look like someone who belongs here," she said gently. Evelyn was too tired to respond with pride or pretense. She simply lowered her head. The woman, who introduced herself as June, offered her a piece of bread and asked nothing in return. "I have a spare room behind my shop," she said. "It's small, but it's warm." Evelyn hesitated. She had been burned by kindness before. But something in June's eyes, calm, steady, unjudging, made her nod. They walked together through quiet streets, and Evelyn noticed how people greeted June with respect. The woman ran a little second-hand store that smelled of cinnamon and dust, tucked between a laundromat and a flower shop. The spare room was tiny, just a cot and a sink, but to Evelyn, it was sanctuary. For the first time in weeks, she slept without fear. The days that followed became a rhythm of small mercies. Evelyn helped June at the store, dusting old furniture, folding clothes, and organizing vintage trinkets. The work was quiet and steady, allowing her time to heal. June didn't ask too many questions, but she always made sure Evelyn had a warm meal and a clean space to rest. "People pass through hard seasons," she once said, pouring her a cup of tea. "What matters is how we plant in them." Evelyn didn't know what she could plant in her season of heartbreak, but those words stuck with her. She started to feel useful again, not just a broken woman hiding behind shelves of forgotten things. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, watching passers-by and sipping tea. June would talk about her late husband and how they'd once dreamed of traveling the world. But life had other plans, she said with a smile that hinted at past sorrows. Evelyn found comfort in that quiet resilience. She hadn't expected to feel peace in a place so humble, but there was something sacred in the simplicity of being seen, of being helped without judgment. For the first time since Oliver had abandoned her, she didn't feel ashamed. She felt human again. She placed a hand on her growing belly and whispered to the child within, "We're going to be okay." The house was old but full of warmth. Evelyn entered June's home and was enveloped by the scent of chamomile tea and lavender. The walls were lined with photographs from decades past, and the furniture showed signs of wear, but there was love in every corner. June led her upstairs to a small room with faded yellow wallpaper and a creaky bed. "It's not much," she said, "but it's yours." Evelyn looked around, feeling both gratitude and grief, gratitude for shelter, grief for how far she had fallen. She sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. That night, Evelyn showered, wrapped herself in a borrowed robe, and ate soup while June knitted in silence. It was the first time she had been treated with care since Oliver had left. There were no judgmental glances, no questions about how she ended up like this. Just presence. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she placed her hand over her belly again. "You're safe now," she whispered. For the first time since being abandoned, she allowed herself to cry without shame. And for the first time, the tears weren't just from despair, they were from the quiet realization that maybe, just maybe, things could begin to change. The next morning, June offered Evelyn more than breakfast, she offered a purpose. I run a small thrift shop down the block. If you want, you can help out. It might keep your mind busy. Evelyn agreed, eager for distraction. The store was cluttered with vintage clothes, chipped porcelain, and forgotten treasures, all carefully displayed. Customers trickled in, each one greeted by name. Evelyn stood behind the counter awkwardly at first, but as hours passed, she began folding clothes, adjusting displays, and learning the rhythm of the shop. Her limbs ached, but it felt good to move, to do something again. As the days turned into weeks, Evelyn found a rhythm. She woke early, helped June open the shop, swept the floor, organized the racks, and sometimes even handled the register. She learned to patch clothing, to negotiate with customers, to spot valuable items. Slowly, people began remembering her name. That's the young woman at June's shop, they said. Each small gesture, a smile from a regular, a compliment on a window display, stitched her back together, one thread at a time. She wasn't just a broken girl anymore. She was rebuilding. Quietly. Steadily. Labor started early one chilly morning. Evelyn woke to a sharp pain in her lower back, followed by a tightening in her abdomen that took her breath away. She tried to stay calm, recalling the breathing techniques she had read about in second-hand parenting books. June rushed her to the nearest clinic, holding her hand the whole way, whispering, "You've got this, sweetheart." The pain intensified, swallowing every thought. Nurses moved quickly, checking monitors, calling for the doctor. Evelyn gritted her teeth through the contractions, sweat pouring from her brow. There was no one else in the delivery room except June. Hours later, Evelyn let out a cry, one of pain, release, and something primal, as a new cry echoed back. A boy. Healthy. Pink. Tiny fists waving at the air. Evelyn looked at him through tears, her heart breaking and healing at once. She named him Noah, the name she had chosen months before, in silence and secrecy. She held him to her chest, whispering, "We're going to be okay." June stood by the window, pretending not to cry, though she wiped her eyes every few seconds. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She stared at her son, studying every breath. This was the beginning of everything. When June first held Noah, her face softened with wonder. "He's beautiful," she said. But there was a flicker of hesitation when she looked at his eyes, the same shade of blue as Oliver's. Evelyn noticed it too. Those eyes, that jawline. The resemblance was unavoidable. But instead of letting it torment her, she made a choice. "You'll look like him," she whispered to Noah, "but you'll never become him." That was her promise. She wouldn't let bitterness define their lives. Her son wouldn't grow up with the weight of abandonment. Still, seeing pieces of Oliver in her child reopened wounds she thought had begun to close. Sometimes when Noah cried a certain way or made a face in his sleep, Evelyn's stomach twisted. She hated that someone so absent could still exist in the shape of her son. But then Noah would grip her finger or fall asleep on her chest, and the hatred melted into love, fierce, protective love. She couldn't control whose features Noah had inherited. But she could control what kind of mother she would be. And she would never let him feel what she had felt, unwanted. Months passed, and the thrift shop, once quiet and worn, began to change under Evelyn's hands. She reorganized the displays, created a simple social media page using June's ancient desktop, and began posting pictures of curated outfits with short stories behind the items. "Vintage finds with a soul," she called it. People began noticing. Curious new customers entered the shop asking for the girl who posts the stories. Evelyn smiled, still shy, but her confidence was growing. The shop began to make more than just enough. It began to thrive. One day, a woman entered the store and asked if Evelyn did styling. She needed help preparing for a job interview but couldn't afford expensive clothes. Evelyn nodded without hesitation. She pulled pieces together, added a scarf for color, and taught the woman how to carry herself with confidence. A week later, the woman returned. She got the job. That moment stayed with Evelyn. She realized she wasn't just selling clothes. She was helping people feel seen. She was helping others rediscover dignity, the very thing she had lost and slowly found again. And that gave her purpose deeper than anything Oliver had ever offered. Evelyn began spending her nights researching small businesses, branding, and e-commerce platforms. She borrowed books from the local library, watched online tutorials using June's outdated laptop, and filled a notebook with sketches, concepts, and slogans. She didn't just want the shop to survive, she wanted it to grow. Each sleepless night wasn't a burden, but a mission. The pain of her past, the weight of her humiliation, became fuel. Every time she saw Noah sleeping peacefully beside her, she remembered why she couldn't afford to give up. He deserved more than a mother surviving. He deserved a mother who was building. By spring, Evelyn proposed a bold idea to June: rebrand the thrift shop into a boutique with curated vintage fashion and a strong online presence. June, initially hesitant, finally said, "I trust you, dear. Just don't forget who you are when you succeed." With June's blessing, Evelyn transformed the store's layout, renamed it Second Light, and created an online storefront. Slowly, orders started coming in, not many, but enough to notice. Clients loved the concept of rescued fashion paired with stories of rebirth and resilience. Evelyn wasn't just selling clothes anymore. She was selling redemption, one garment at a time. One evening, a man in his 60s entered the shop, browsing silently before selecting a vintage leather jacket. Evelyn rang him up and, as always, shared the story behind the piece. He listened intently, then smiled. "You've got an eye for more than fashion. You've got vision." His name was Charles Whitman, a semi-retired investor who had once led a fashion supply chain firm. He returned the next day, not for clothes, but for conversation. And then again the next. They talked about sustainability, ethics in fashion, and growth models. One day, he asked gently, "Have you considered scale?" Evelyn blinked. "Me? This is just a shop." He shook his head. "This could be a movement." At first, Evelyn hesitated. Her heart wasn't in boardrooms or negotiations. But Charles's mentorship was unlike anything she'd experienced. He didn't tell her what to do, he asked questions that made her think deeper. He respected her ideas, challenged her gently, and reminded her of her worth without ever mentioning her past. Slowly, Evelyn started to believe that Second Light wasn't just a boutique, it was a brand. And maybe, just maybe, it could reach farther than the small corner it currently occupied. Charles offered to connect her with a few trusted investors at a small startup showcase. "Just tell your story," he said. "That's your biggest asset." Evelyn walked into the startup showcase holding Noah's hand and a bag of carefully selected samples. The venue was polished and modern, full of confident voices, stylish people, and sharp suits. She wore a second-hand black blazer, repurposed by her own sewing. Her heart thumped wildly, but her spine was straight. When her name was called, she stepped forward, holding her breath. On stage, under the lights, she didn't read from her cards. She spoke from the ache in her chest. My name is Evelyn. I used to be invisible. I was left pregnant, homeless, and humiliated. But one act of kindness saved me. And now, I want to use fashion to do the same for others. Gasps rippled through the room, and silence followed, the kind that demanded listening. She spoke of stories sewn into every dress, of women who came in broken and left believing in their reflection again. She showed her online platform, modest but growing, and explained her expansion plans. When she finished, no one moved at first. Then came the applause, loud, full, and real. Investors approached her with cards, some with tears in their eyes. Evelyn stepped off the stage trembling, but not from fear. For the first time, she felt she had stepped into her power, not as a victim of circumstance, but as the author of her future. In the hallway outside the presentation room, Evelyn paused to check her messages. That's when she heard a voice she hadn't heard in nearly 2 years. You've got to trust me, this will be the next big thing, the voice said confidently. She turned, slowly, and there he was. Oliver. Dressed in a tailored suit, charming a group of investors with rehearsed charisma. Her stomach turned. He hadn't seen her yet, but she froze, watching him work the room like he always had, polished, insincere, dangerous. He was pitching a tech platform related to fashion supply chains, boasting of data analytics and AI-driven solutions. Evelyn felt nauseated. She slipped into the crowd, hoping to avoid him, but fate had other plans. Minutes later, they nearly collided by the espresso stand. His smile faltered. Evelyn, he said, disbelief coating his voice. She stared at him, calm and unmoved. Hello, Oliver. He blinked, then glanced at her badge. Wait, you're one of the presenters? She gave a tight nod. He laughed, not kindly. Wow. Didn't see that coming. You're in fashion now? His tone was smug. Evelyn met his gaze, unflinching. No. I'm in rebuilding. And business is going well. Oliver's expression twisted slightly, uncertain whether to be amused or threatened. That's surprising, he muttered. But deep in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something unfamiliar, doubt. The next day, Evelyn was invited to a private investor brunch. She arrived early, her presentation materials ready. As she took her seat at the table, her breath caught. Oliver was seated across from her. He looked equally surprised, though he masked it with a half-smile. Before she could speak, a woman joined their table, one of the top angel investors in sustainable fashion. I'm excited to hear more from you, Evelyn, she said warmly. Oliver's eyes darted between them. You two know each other? He asked, trying to mask the tension in his voice. The woman nodded. She's the most authentic pitch I've heard in years. Evelyn thanked her softly, not looking at Oliver. As the brunch went on, Oliver tried to interject, to steer conversations back to his platform. But the attention kept drifting back to Evelyn, her story, her numbers, her vision. At one point, an investor leaned over to Oliver and whispered, "You should have partnered with someone like her." Oliver's jaw tightened. After the event, he approached Evelyn in the hallway. So, this is really what you're doing now? He asked. This is who you've become. Evelyn looked at him, her voice quiet but firm. No. This is who I always was. You just didn't see it. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Oliver speechless for the first time. Days after the brunch, Evelyn received an email from a well-known editorial blog asking to interview her for a feature on modern women entrepreneurs. The article titled "Second Light: The Boutique Turning Broken Stories into Strength" was shared widely. Orders tripled in a week. She hired 2 part-timers and began scouting for a larger workspace. Meanwhile, Charles arranged a meeting with a major eco-retail distributor, and Evelyn negotiated with calm authority. She wasn't the woman who once begged for support. She was now the one offering opportunity. The past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined her. The buzz around her business reached unexpected places. One afternoon, a man in a crisp suit entered her boutique with a familiar expression, polite but transactional. "My firm represents Oliver Grant," he said, offering a card. "He's interested in discussing a potential collaboration. He's launching a new fashion tech initiative and believes your brand would align well with the platform." Evelyn listened without flinching. "Tell him I said thank you," she replied, then paused. "But I prefer partnerships rooted in integrity, not convenience." The man nodded awkwardly and left. She didn't need to seek revenge. Watching him come full circle, seeking validation from the woman he once discarded, was enough. Oliver's company, once promising, began faltering after several investors pulled out. One of them, impressed by Evelyn, reallocated funds to her project instead. Rumors spread that Oliver's pitch was derivative, and his tech model lacked originality. Evelyn remained publicly silent, but inside, she couldn't help but feel the ironic poetry of it all. He had once dismissed her as incapable of even raising a child. Now he was chasing stability in the shadow of her success. One morning, she received a message. It was from him. "Can we talk?" it said. No explanation. No apology. Just a request. She ignored it at first. But he kept trying emails, a letter delivered to the shop, and finally, he appeared in person, standing outside Second Light, holding a small bouquet of white flowers. "I just want a conversation," he said softly. Evelyn allowed him in, mostly out of curiosity. He looked thinner, tired, like the arrogance had cracked. "I made mistakes," he said. "You didn't deserve what I did to you." She didn't interrupt. "And I know he's mine." Evelyn's expression darkened. "You don't get to speak about my son like he's yours." "You walked away from that, right?" Oliver blinked, clearly not expecting that level of resolve. She stood and calmly opened the door. "This conversation is over." After Oliver's visit, Evelyn sat by the window that night watching Noah sleep. She thought about all the moments she had wished for help, the fevers, the exhaustion, the days she skipped meals just to buy formula. And now, the man who caused all that had the nerve to reappear with apologies and expectations. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The next day, she wrote an open blog post on her business site. Not naming names, but telling her story in detail: abandonment, fear, struggle, and the unshakable bond between her and her son. The post went viral. Women wrote in from all over, thanking her for putting words to their pain. A single mother from Ohio wrote, "I thought I was alone. Thank you for showing me I'm not." A teacher from New Jersey said, "You didn't just build a business, you built a beacon." Evelyn read each comment slowly, holding their weight in her hands. Oliver, meanwhile, faced the opposite. Clients dropped him. His name started circulating in whispers. Wasn't he the guy who left her when she was pregnant? Evelyn never said those words. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when silence is stronger than revenge. Eventually, Evelyn was invited to speak at a women's entrepreneurship panel alongside authors, investors, and founders. She wore a navy dress stitched from salvaged materials, designed by one of her trainees. On stage, she spoke without bitterness, only clarity. There was a time when my life fell apart in public. But I rebuilt it quietly, piece by piece, until people had no choice but to notice again, not because of what I'd lost, but because of what I created. Applause followed. In the crowd, cameras flashed, and among them was someone unexpected, Oliver. Watching. Listening. That night, he posted his own statement on social media. For the first time, he named her. Years ago, I abandoned someone who needed me most. I walked away from responsibility and love. She rebuilt her world without me, and better than anything I ever dreamed. Evelyn, I'm sorry. The post garnered attention. Some praised his honesty. Others criticized it as performative. Evelyn read it once, then closed her phone. She didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't something owed. It was something earned. And for her, silence was more powerful than any reply. Her son didn't need a viral moment. He needed consistency, something Oliver never gave. A month later, Evelyn received an invitation from a leading fashion magazine. They wanted to do a feature on sustainable designers changing the industry. The cover would feature her and Noah. At first, she hesitated. I don't want him exposed, she said to June. But the editor reassured her, no focus on her past, just her work and her son's role in inspiring it. The photo shoot took place in a nearby garden. Noah wore a repurposed linen shirt and held a wildflower bouquet. Evelyn stood behind him, her hand gently on his shoulder. The cover headline read, "Second Light, the woman who stitched strength from scraps." When the magazine hit newsstands, it sold out in hours. Her website crashed from traffic. But more than the sales or attention, Evelyn noticed something else. The tone had shifted. People no longer saw her as the woman who was left. They saw her as the woman who rose. June brought champagne home that night. To the girl who was never broken, she toasted. Evelyn smiled. To the boy who saved me without even knowing. In that moment, she realized she hadn't just survived. She had become unforgettable. One crisp autumn morning, Evelyn opened her shop to find an envelope slipped under the door. It was a letter, not from Oliver, but from his mother. The handwriting was delicate, uncertain. Inside, she apologized for her silence, admitting that her son's departure had been orchestrated under pressure. I begged him not to leave you, she wrote, but my husband threatened to cut him off entirely. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read the words again. It didn't erase what happened, but it cast a different light on it, not softer, but more complex. Her anger, once firm, began to crack. Later that night, June found her sitting quietly in the back room. You okay? She asked. Evelyn nodded, slowly. Did he really leave me just for money? Could someone abandon love for comfort? June poured tea and sat beside her. People do desperate things when they're scared, she said. But that doesn't excuse them. It just explains them. Evelyn stared at her reflection in the tea's surface, her mind wrestling with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answers to. Could she really move forward if a part of her was still chained to a version of the past she didn't fully understand? A week later, Oliver showed up again. This time, he didn't come with flowers or apologies. He came with a binder. "I've been rebuilding," he said. "And I want to invest in you." In second light. Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. "Is this about redemption or about relevance?" she asked, her voice sharp. Oliver looked tired but earnest. "Maybe both," he said. "But mostly because I believe in what you've built." He extended the binder across the counter. She didn't touch it. "You had a chance to believe in me when all I had was nothing," she said. "Why should I believe in you now?" They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Oliver admitted, "I lost everything, Evelyn. And the only thing I couldn't stop thinking about was what I left behind. I didn't just walk away from you. I walked away from myself." Evelyn felt something shift, not forgiveness, not trust, but curiosity. "And you think investing will fix that?" she asked. Oliver shook his head. "No. But maybe being part of something good, even if I don't deserve it, might be a start." She told him she'd think about it. As he left, binder in hand, Evelyn stood at the door, unsure whether she had just witnessed growth or manipulation. Days passed and Evelyn wrestled with the decision. Everyone around her had opinions. Some said to keep him far, others said to accept the investment and control the terms. But deep inside, Evelyn knew something money couldn't outweigh: peace. She met with Oliver at a nearby cafe, and before he could speak, she slid a note across the table. "No," it read. Oliver looked up, confused. "You're not even going to hear the terms?" Evelyn leaned in. "It's not about the deal. It's about the principle. I built this with pain, with fire. I won't share it with someone who watched me burn." Oliver sat back, visibly wounded, but she didn't feel joy in rejecting him. Only clarity. "I appreciate the apology," she added. "But my brand was born in your absence. Its strength came from survival. And I won't let survival be diluted by your regret." He nodded, slowly, realizing she wasn't bluffing. As Evelyn walked away, her steps felt lighter. Not because she had one, but because she had chosen herself over history. For the first time, she wasn't reacting to the past. She was writing her future without asking anyone's permission. That night, June entered Evelyn's room holding an old box. This came by courier. From his mother. Inside were several letters, all dated from the early days of Evelyn's pregnancy. She hesitated, then read them. They were from Oliver. Angry, scared, and then, slowly, apologetic. One described sitting outside their old apartment door, too ashamed to knock. Another spoke of watching her from across the street, seeing her belly grow and hating himself. But none had been sent. Evelyn's throat tightened. These were not excuses. But they were pieces of truth she never had. She read every one until the morning light poured into the window. Noah stirred in the next room, unaware of the years and choices that had led to his existence. Evelyn didn't cry. She simply felt still. She placed the letters back into the box and whispered, "You were weak. I was strong. That's the difference." And she knew now that even though Oliver might have regretted it, even though fear may have driven him, she had never needed him to return. What she needed, she had found, within herself, within June, and within the little boy who called her mom. The next week, Evelyn decided to meet Oliver one last time. Not for negotiation. Not for closure, but for truth. They met at a quiet park bench under the shade of a maple tree. She handed him the letters. "I read them," she said. He nodded, eyes down. "They were real," he murmured. "I wanted to send them. But my father said if I tried to go back to you, he'd cut off everything. And I let that scare me more than losing you." Evelyn stayed silent for a moment. "So you chose your father's approval over your own child?" Oliver's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "I was 28 and still acting like a boy," he said. "You became a mother. I didn't become anything." Evelyn looked at him, not with anger, but with finality. "That's what this all comes down to. You feared discomfort. I embraced it." He nodded. "I know." They sat in silence before she stood. "You can write your own redemption story. But I won't be a chapter in it." As she walked away, Oliver stayed seated, clutching the box of letters, fragments of a past that would never rewrite the present. Evelyn didn't look back. She didn't need to. In the weeks that followed their final conversation, Oliver attempted to disappear from public view. Articles once praising his brilliance now questioned his ethics. His silence was interpreted as retreat, and slowly, people lost interest. But Evelyn couldn't shake the lingering question: was his apology real, or another performance? She knew he had been broken by his own choices, but that didn't make him worthy of rebuilding with her name beside his. So she let the past die with dignity, refusing to breathe life into it again. Forgiveness, she realized, didn't require reunion. It only required release. Meanwhile, Second Light flourished. The boutique launched a collaboration with a local women's shelter, offering job training and mentorship to survivors. Evelyn walked into each session with sleeves rolled up, not as a boss, but as a sister in pain and perseverance. Her story wasn't just personal anymore, it had become a platform. One of hope, of grit, of starting over with nothing but a will to stand. And every time she stood before a crowd or sat beside a woman too ashamed to speak, she simply said, "You don't owe the world your silence. You owe yourself your voice." Months passed, and Evelyn received a call from the editor of a national women's journal. They wanted to feature her for their annual Women of Impact edition. "Not just for fashion," the editor said, "but for the emotional economy you've created. For what you represent." Evelyn hesitated. The spotlight had never been her goal. But June reminded her, the right story told at the right time can save someone. So she agreed. The interview was long, vulnerable, and real. She spoke not just of Oliver, but of Noah. Of choosing courage over comfort. Of failing with grace and rising with grit. On the day of the shoot, Evelyn wore a tailored outfit crafted from discarded fabrics. Noah, now 5, stood beside her, grinning shyly. The photographer asked if she wanted to include a quote beside her image. Evelyn thought for a moment, then said, "Write this: being abandoned didn't break me. It built me." The photographer paused, then nodded slowly. Evelyn looked at Noah, his eyes wide with wonder. She didn't need to shield him from the past. She had rewritten it, not by denying its weight, but by proving she could carry it with pride. When the magazine hit newsstands, Evelyn's face smiled from the cover, her arm around Noah. "Strength sown in silence," the headline read. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of letters poured in, from survivors, dreamers, mothers, and even teenage girls trying to find their place in a world that often judged too quickly. Evelyn read each message with care, moved by the way her wounds had helped others heal. Second Light saw record growth. A publishing house offered her a book deal. And for the first time, Evelyn wasn't just surviving motherhood in memory, she was leading a movement. Noah began school and quickly became known as the boy who helps with the clothes. He loved folding fabric, choosing buttons, and naming each new mannequin. One afternoon, as Evelyn prepared for a speaking engagement, Noah asked, "Do you think Dad ever thinks about us?" Evelyn knelt down, holding his hands. "Maybe," she said gently. "But what matters is that I think of you. Every single day. And that I always will." He nodded, content. She watched him walk away, her heart full, not of ache, but of purpose. One quiet morning, Evelyn passed by a local coffee shop and saw Oliver seated alone by the window. He looked older, smaller. A shadow of the man who once shattered her. For a moment, she paused. He looked up and their eyes met. No words were exchanged. No gestures. Just a silent understanding that the past no longer held power over the present. She walked on, feeling lighter. Oliver would always be part of her story, but only as a chapter, not the whole book. Back at the boutique, a new intern asked her how she got started. Evelyn smiled and replied, with a broken heart, an empty room, and a reason to try again. The intern laughed, thinking it was just a poetic metaphor. But Evelyn knew the truth. Her life had once been in pieces, scattered across betrayal and benches and borrowed kindness. Now it stood strong, sewn together by resilience, framed by growth, and driven by something no one could ever take from her again. Years later, Evelyn stood on a TED stage, lights warming her face, a full audience in silent anticipation. She took a breath and began. "My name is Evelyn, and once upon a time, I was left with nothing. Not even a crib for my child. But that's not where my story ends, it's where it begins." Her voice carried steady and clear, unfolding not a tale of tragedy, but of triumph. She spoke of choices, of walking away not in weakness but in wisdom. Of how some people lose everything and still find themselves in the process. As she concluded, she looked into the crowd and smiled. "We are not what people do to us. We are what we choose to become in spite of them." The audience rose in applause, many with tears in their eyes. Backstage, Noah ran into her arms, taller now, still full of light. Evelyn held him close and whispered, "We made it." And somewhere deep inside, she knew the truth, she had never been a victim of abandonment. She had always been the author of a story the world would never forget.